some of what this class is going to look like. Basically, you might have been watching the news, seeing what's going on recently, and there are a lot of things thrown around, like Israel being white colonists, like Israel settling this land, the British enforcing us. And so we thought it was important to come on and talk about how Israel got its borders and why they ended up the way it does today. And so my first question I always ask myself is, where do we start? Because, of course, history is connected, nothing exists in a bubble. What started today started a long, long time ago. And I can't do all of history in an hour as much as I would like to. So I had to kind of pick somewhere to start. So for me, the kind of clear place to start is first with the Ottoman Empire in the Middle Ages and then rising through. So I kind of want to start by showing you guys a map, and I will do my best to not be too technologically challenged here. There we go. So this is a map of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle Ages, 1566. The Ottoman Empire was an expanding empire. It was an Arab empire, a Muslim empire, and it expanded based on what is modern-day Turkey. And as you can see, at its height, it spread all through North Africa, it spread into Europe, it spread throughout the Middle East, into Saudi Arabian Empire. Everything that is dark green was considered a major part of the Ottoman Empire. Everything light green was a protectorate, tributary. So these are all areas that they had influence in. And of course, what we're kind of focused on today is the area of what is, say, modern-day Israel. So where you see on the map, there's a dot, Jerusalem. That's where we're going to be focused. So you can see that already in the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, it is under the Ottoman Empire. Now, with an area this big, especially when there was no phones and no cars and no computers to control things, the question was, how do you control a large area from a central place? And what they did was they broke things into protectorates, right, into areas. And so the area that is today Israel was a sultan, was a section of the government. So it had its own local governor that responded to the main government of the Ottoman Empire. And so some things they had kind of control over their day-to-day life. Other things they had to respond back to the Ottoman Empire for taxes, for basic laws, and they were considered part, not separate, of the Ottoman Empire. So I want to keep that all in the back of your head. The other thing that's going on at the same time is that the world is shifting. We have a colliding group of ideas, starting already with the Reformation, this challenge against religion, but most importantly, with the Enlightenment. And now, how many of you guys remember back to your high school days of John Locke and Rousseau and Montesquieu and all these names that probably ring a bell in the back of your head and maybe you don't remember exactly what each one said? But the long story short is that each of them said something along the lines of, humans are humans, we're individuals. Some of them said we're born good, some of them said we're born bad. All of them said we have choice and we have individual characteristics and we can challenge our leaders, that there's social contracts, that our government has to listen to the people and not the other way around. And that led to a huge shift. Now, I'll tell you, I come at this, my background is in teaching history, is in AP World, is in regular history, not in Jewish history. I didn't grow up in a Jewish education environment. And so for me, when I look at Jewish history is a reflection of the time it's in. So this same, enlightenment, this idea of enlightenment and challenging the government affects the Jewish world. And the Jews who are in these small communities, typically cut off from the rest of their communities, they have a greater Christian community or Muslim community, start saying, we like these ideas. They start hearing about Locke and they hear about Rousseau and they say, these ideas of enlightenment, what in Hebrew we call haskalah, this challenge, we like this and we want to apply it to ourselves. So they start to take these ideas. Now, this is a slippery slope of the world. When you start saying humans are individuals and they're people and now they have ideas, what does that lead to? It leads to challenges and revolutions. And so what comes on the tail of this enlightenment is the rise of nationalism. Because what comes after I'm an individual, we might not want to agree to it, but what do individuals all want? We want to be part of a group. We want to have family. We want to have connections. We want to have tribes. We want to feel like we are part of something greater than ourselves. So we start to look around the world and we say, yes, I'm an individual, but also I'm an American. And what does that mean? What does it mean to be an American? If I were to ask you, I'm going to assume most of you are in America, though maybe I'm wrong. What does it mean to you? What does it mean to be part of a nation? Anyone have a thought? Like, what does it define you as an American? You can put in the chat box. You can raise your hand. Or I can keep talking. Yes, I'm gonna, yeah. Emily, yes.
So I would actually argue that before you define as a nation, you define as smaller, like from an anthropological perspective, right? It's family first, then local community. But it's this idea of wanting to group yourself in a way where you're willing to share resources across that group and defend those resources against other people.
Good. So it's people that we want to defend, that we relate to. What are some things that tie us to people? Like, if I'm going to say I want to relate to these people, what are things that I associate myself that make me feel like when you walk into a room, you say, this is where I belong? Good. I see Vicky and I see language. Language is an important one, right? As much as we are English speakers, we all know I led a group of Australians last year, and Australians don't speak English. I don't know. They use all these words. They kept talking about Rashis and, there's all these slang for everything. It's English. It's not my English, right? So that is an important one. Language, even if it's language, slang, accents, right? You can probably tell I'm a Californian by the way I flat tone everything versus other people, Bostonians, who might have a heavier accent. Beliefs and values. So good, what you might believe in, whether it's religion, right? That might tie you together. Good, other people saying race, right? So it might tie together on race. Race can be a tricky one because how you present and then how you feel can be maybe two different things. Geography is important. We like boundaries. We're closest to the people who are near us. It tends to be. I always joke when I get my first group of students from Alexander Muss who come from all over America, and they come in and they're like, oh, we're all Americans. But the kid from Hawaii doesn't really agree with anything the kid from Florida says because they, see themselves as two different kinds of people. Good. What else do we see? Culture, right? Food is an important one. The types of food you eat, the type of spices you eat. Music, that's a great one, right? You might, if you're, a European, you have a certain tone that you tend to listen to versus North Africa is different. Shared history, right? If you, the same thing with family, right? Family isn't always blood. It's also people that you grow up with, people like it's who are part of your childhood. It's thinking about siblings, being able to turn to somebody and like have that shared memory is an important thing. Okay, great. These are great. Religion, right? And again, religion could both be a tying thing and also a dividing thing, but it's very important. And when you talk about this is going to be important when we talk about the future, all Christianity is not the same. All Judaism is not the same. All Islam is not the same. And so when we talk about religion, we often talk about even just smaller sections of that. So these are all things that are going to lead to the rise of nationalism, because people are going to turn around and they're going to say, we want to associate, we are individuals, and we are tying ourselves to these people near us, and we deserve our own independence. Because again, if we are tying into this idea that we have a contract with our government, that I am able to say that the government, I am going to agree to their laws and they're going to treat me right, they're not going to, mass murder me because they feel like it, then there is a contract here. And I can say, I want that government to reflect who I am, to reflect who the people are here, right? So we begin to get these independence movements that spread all over throughout Europe, throughout the Caribbean, throughout South America, throughout basically the whole world, although it takes a little bit longer. Everything, again, time is where we exactly decide to start is tricky, but starting with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, we talk about the Greeks under the Ottoman Empire, we talk about Haiti, all these revolutionary movements, all starting around the same time, that are all pushing towards this idea that we are representative by our government, and we want our government to represent who we are. And the Jews aren't out of this loop, because the Jews are looking around and they're saying, all these governments that are representing people, you might see this difference between the French government and the German government, but to us, none of them are Jewish. They don't represent who we are. Therefore, we want a government that represents us. So that's where we get the start of these Zionist movements, that say, how can the Jews join in this nationalist movement And how can we also gain a state security in the same way that all these other nations are doing, okay? Now, you might have heard of Theodor Herzl. He's the most well-known Zionist. He is not the first. He's not the last. He's not the only one in any of these ways. He is maybe the loudest or the most well-known. He writes a lot. And he is specific because when we talk about Zionism, about this idea that Jews deserve a state, that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. And Herzl was a person of his time, right? Again, he grew up in Europe. He was part of these movements, of these nationalist movements. He was actually someone who actually wasn't super tied to his Jewish identity at the beginning and said, I want to become part of these nations. I want to be, you know, like anybody else. And then he saw these rise in anti-Semitism, and he saw the fact that no one would ever really treat him as an equal. And he said, this is what we need. But he had a very specific idea. He said, if we're going to create a Jewish state, how do we have to do it? We have to be just like every other nation. And what does that mean? It means if we're going to create a state, we have to do it politically. We have to make friends. We have to turn to Britain and to France and to everybody, the US, and we have to say, we need a state, help us find a state, agree to us having a state, we're going to do it politically, and we're going to create it just like any other nation. We're not different at all, okay? That's only one type of Zionism. There's a whole class we can do on the different types of Zionism. I just want to mention some other things that are going to be important later on. There is labor Zionism. A.D. Gordon, this idea that the Jews in Europe mostly, but also in the Americas, have become weak. They spent their time studying and learning. They become bankers and doctors and that kind of stuff, and they don't know the land. And the only way to truly have a state, I mean, what's the most important thing we need? The base of our existence is food and water. And so if we can't learn how to work the land like anybody else, if we can't control the land, then we don't have a state. We can't exist. And so A.D. Gordon said the first thing we have to do is change our mindset. And this is actually something we do a lot at Alexander Muss, is try to push our students out of those boundaries of the kind of, often most places in America, most places in the modern world, maybe we don't have active interactions with our food, right? We pick them up at the grocery store. It's great, right? But the work that goes in, you might know that when you work at something, when you grow something, right? This feeling that I've produced something actually connects you more to the land. So A.D. Gordon said, if we're going to really be a state, we have to connect to the land. In addition, there's the third type of Zionism I'm going to mention, although again, there's more, is revisionist Zionism and Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky was someone who agreed with Herzl at the beginning, who said, yeah, we need a state, we got to be political, and then quickly lost his hope that that was ever going to happen. And basically said, how are we going to ever control a state? It's nice to have the land. It's nice to have our big buddies behind us, but we have to change ourselves. And we have to, basically, it's like Boy Scouts. We have to learn to live off the land. We have to learn to have an army. We have to have a language because, again, different Jews around the world speak different languages at this point. We have Yiddish. We have people who just, speak English, who speak their local languages. We have Ladino, we have Arabic, we have Jews speaking all sorts of languages, and that won't connect us. So we need to bring back that language. We need to bring back that kind of sense of we're going to, A, have our food, but also our self-security. We're going to know how to fight for ourselves. So these are all happening, again, at the same time that the rest of the world is, in the 1800s, pushing towards these self-control through these statehoods, right? We see this all over the nationalism in Italy, all throughout Europe, and all throughout the world, basically. So I'm going to kind of skip forward to 1903. By 1903, this idea of a Jewish state has been percolating around for a couple decades. We have a Zionist Congress. Again, if we're going to have a state, we have to have a government. So we're going to start planning for that. And 1903 is a really difficult year for the Jews across the world. The biggest thing that happens is something called the Kishinev pogrom. And a pogrom is a massacre, basically. And this is one that really strikes the world's attention. It's not the first. Number-wise, it's not the biggest, but it is shocking. It is the businesses are destroyed. People are dying. It is massacring. There are all sorts of horrible, horrible stories about how people are killed, babies cut out of stomachs, all sorts of terrible things that are happening. And Chaim Nachman Bialik, who was a young writer at the time, travels to Kishinev and writes a poem. And he writes a poem called City of Slaughter. I recommend if you ever have a chance and you want to read it, we might do a class on it at some point because it's actually coming back in today after what happened recently. City of Slaughter it's a very depressing poem. It's very detailed about the atrocities that happened. But why it shocked the Jewish world is because Chaim Nachman Bialik basically accuses, if that's the right word, the Jews of being weak, of not standing up, of not fighting back. Now, he's not being super accusatory. It's very, you're in a terrible situation and what would you do? But there becomes this feeling like now's the time. Things are getting worse and the Jews need to learn to stand up for themselves and they need to learn to figure out how to keep themselves safe. And Kishinev is a huge marker of that. So in 1903, the British approached Herzl and they said, we have an idea. We can't get you Israel, Palestine. We know you want that area because it's connected to the Jews, but what if we get you Uganda? Uganda's great. It's in Africa. I'm not gonna say there's nobody there because there are definitely people there, but in the British mindset, there's plenty of land to settle. It'll be great. It'll be fine. From the British point of view, we could use, friends in the area. Why don't you go settle in Uganda? Now, Herzl originally was like, no way, I'm not interested. But after the pogrom happened and after 1903 was going terrible, he started thinking, maybe this is like where we should start, right? If things are getting bad right now and the Jews are dying, then let's put them in Uganda and see what happens. At least we'll be safe, right? At least we'll have a country of our own. And he proposed this to the Zionist Congress in 1903. Any guesses on what the Zionist Congress said? Yeah, there was a lot of no's. There was some storming out. It was quite dramatic. Although it wasn't a complete and absolute no, because again, there was this feeling that the end of the world was coming, that this was a terrible, terrible time and Jews need to band together. So although the answer was mostly no, Herzl managed to convince the Congress to put together a exploratory committee. Let's go down to Uganda and see what it looks like. So they sent a group down to Uganda in 1904. It was fine. They didn't really like the weather. That was pretty much like the biggest complaint about it. That I'm not sure that it was much better, honestly, but Uganda weather they did not particularly like. But in the end, it didn't pan out, because of the Congress's opposition to it, but also because of the external politics, because again, there were people living there who did not particularly want the British to decide dropping these, Jews in the middle of it, because the British had other interests then, they got involved. So it didn't really pan out for a lot of reasons, but that was the point the Jews were at, that we just need any space to keep ourselves safe and to ensure that we have a future. Now, we want it to be in this land of Israel that we are connected to and we have a history from, but maybe it doesn't have to be. So it's just kind of trickling there in the back. So that's now off the table. It's now the early 1900s, and World War I breaks out. So World War I is obviously a very big thing. It almost takes over the whole world, because it doesn't, but in our Western centered mind, it does take over the whole world and everyone gets involved, including the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire is where Jerusalem is where this area of Israel is that we want to control. And the Jews who are here have a really interesting conundrum. Okay, on the one hand, they are citizens, they are controlled by the Ottoman Empire, right? That's where they belong. So who are they supposed to fight for? They're supposed to fight for the Ottoman Empire, in theory. On the other hand, who's on the other side? You got the British, who the Jews have been working with, trying to figure it out. The British are promising them all sorts of things. The British are saying, if you come help us just a little bit, we'll do some nice things for you. Maybe there'll be some statehood involved. We'll get to that in a minute because they like to promise lots of things to lots of people. But on the whole, the Jewish community in the land of Palestine, in this land of the Ottoman Empire, decide to fight for the British. And they actually have, again, this could be a whole course in and of itself of Jewish support in World War I. There is a secret underground service called Neely. Chaim Weitzman is off creating acetone, nail polish, and blowing things up in the corner. We have a Jewish militia that is fighting. If you want to come down to visit Israel and you want to come down to visit Beersheba, there's cavalry. The last major cavalry battle fought in the world is down here. I know there were horses in World War II, but those weren't really battles. They were getting massacred by the Germans. So as far as a battle, the last one really down here is in Beersheba. And again, this is already the 19-teens, so it's not so long ago. So I'm going to fast forward to the war. I know that was quick, but the war ends. And During the war, again, the British have been promising this land to everybody. Now, the Jews have been doing some also side deals. We have Chaim Weizmann, who's this British citizen who is well connected. He's a scientist. And he becomes representative of the Jewish people of the Zionist Congress. And he meets with Faisal I. Faisal I is the king of Iraq. And he starts an agreement, starts under the table, becomes official, in which he, Faisal, this king of Iraq, and Weizmann, they sit down and they kind of hammer out this idea of what could it be to have a Jewish state in the area. Now, Faisal isn't like totally blind here. He wants certain things also. So he wants certain parts of the land. He agrees to a very small portion of the land. And I want to just read you one little section that's written in this document. It says, the two main branches of the Semitic family, Arabs and Jews, understand one another, and I hope that as a result of the interchange of ideas at the peace conference will be guided by the ideas of self-determination and nationality. Each nation will make definite progress towards the realization of its aspiration. Arabs are not jealous of Zionist Jews and intend to give them fair play, and the Zionist Jews have assured the nationalist Arabs of their intention that they too have fair play in their respective areas. Turkish intrigue in Palestine has raised jealousy between the Jewish colonists and the local peasants, but the mutual understanding of the aims of Arabs and Jews will at once clear away the last traces of form of bitterness. So again, this document very clearly seems to state that we have this group of Arabs and this group of Jews who are both willing to draw their lines in the sand and kind of keep peace. Even though there's some troublemakers in the locals, but we'll figure that out. I will say it's an interesting note that in this whole document, which they both sign, is that at the bottom, there's kind of a handwritten note by Faisal that kind of says, you know, I don't really, like, it's probably, but if anything changes in the future, I might go back on this. So there's a nice, like, little note just kind of like giving him an out in the bottom. It's a handwritten side piece. So there is this kind of movement, right? Yes, Liz.
Well, what was in it for them initially? Like, why would an Iraqi king be interested in this region at all? I mean, maybe to protect some of the Arabs there, but what was the original interest?
So I'm going to show you another map because it's a great question. 1 second, if I can pull up my technology here. So I'm going to skip ahead 1 second, but I'll come back to it. This is the Ottoman Empire, basically, right? This is post World War I. We'll get to the mandates in a second and what they actually mean. But we've got this chunk of Iraq, right? We have this chunk of what's going to become at some point Jordan and Syria and Lebanon. Now, I mentioned this briefly and maybe you caught it, but what's the challenge between these areas of Iraq and the areas of Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan? One of the big challenges is what type of Muslim you are and what kind of influence you have. So there's basically two main branches of Islam, Sunni and Shia, and they don't typically like each other. And in many states, it's actually the majority isn't necessarily the ruling power. And they have different beliefs on who should be ruling, but also some of their basic beliefs. So Faisal thought that if he could have this influence, you see that chunk of like Syria, Lebanon, that he could get influence all the way into Israel and just give him a little chunk of Israel, right? So that he could expand his influence into what is now basically Syria and Lebanon. And then he would give the Jews that little bottom chunk, right? And that would, does that make sense? Like that would increase his hold, okay? So that wasn't it for him. At the same time, again, during the war, you might have heard we have the Sykes-Picot Agreement where all these, Western countries are trying to figure out, how to divide up this area. And then we have kind of like the big star or thorn in our side, depending on how you think about it, is the Balfour Declaration. Again, this is during the war. The British are still trying to get their side. And I will pull it up here because I know I speak fast and I know I want you guys to really, this is going to be another point where I want you to really think about it and to do some textual analysis here, because not to throw the British under the bus, but if anyone is thinking about British, what they say, there's often a lot of underlying thoughts on what is written. So here's what
I was going to write in the chat, but I didn't want to be seen as anti-British, but I said they always talk out of both ends of their mouth. That's what they've been doing for years.
Yes. So let's see what they say. And this is, again, the famous Balfour Declaration. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious right of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political statuses enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you'll bring this up to the declaration for the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Anyone have any things that stick out to them or thoughts on this amazing promise of a Jewish state? Because that's what we toot this as, right? The Jews say, yeah,
it's basically immediately negated by that sentence. Nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities.
Yeah. Like, what does that mean? I mean, it could be like, we're all democratic and yay us, or it could be, sorry, you can't be Jewish because that goes against, the local community.
Or we're going to do nothing to protect you. Basically, you're going to come, but you're not safe.
Yeah. Other sentences or lines, words? Oh, sorry, there's a chat. I gotta go to the chat one second. Anything else that sticks out to you? I'll give you a little hint of my favorite part, right? His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home. Now that sentence right there is my favorite sentence of the whole thing. So what does that mean? His Majesty's government view with favor. Does that mean they're going to support us? Maybe not. Not super.
It's obtuse on purpose. Right. It's unclear.
Right.
It clearly means they won't actively work against it, I think, but that's as much as you can say.
Right. And then it says
they'll be bystanders, but not involved. Okay.
Right. And then it says in Palestine. Why is that important? What could in Palestine possibly mean? Or could it not mean?
Maybe just limiting it to Palestine instead of making sure that it's not seen as taking over a larger area. That's
probably valid. If I told you that that I agree to you having a homeland, I don't know, in Florida, what would that mean to you? Would that mean all of Florida, part of Florida, Miami? What does in Palestine mean, right? That's a very vague, that's not an outline. That's not a location. It's not a guarantee of a certain amount of land, right? Somewhere in the land, you'll have some space problem, right? And then tie that into the next thing of a national home. What's a national home? Or what is it not? Maybe.
It's certainly not a country. It doesn't use the word country.
Right. Doesn't use country, doesn't use state, not sort of any control, power. It might be, right? But it's vague enough to leave that open, right? So on the one hand, the Balfour Declaration, I don't want to, well, I did just undercut it a lot. I know, I mean like that, but it was astounding at the time. It was a statement by a major government supporting a Jewish cause for a Jewish homeland. So that is a huge thing. We can't just throw that under the bus. On the other hand, it wasn't declaring a Jewish state, right? It was saying that we'll probably support you if it kind of supports us in the right ways, right? So we come out of World War I, and on the one hand, we have this support. Good, exactly. We're trying to appease the Jews without really getting into it, without tying ourselves to things. The end of World War I, we also have the creation of our League of Nations, because World War I sucked, let's be honest. A lot of people died. We destroyed all of Europe. Trench warfare destroyed people and homelands and food and the whole thing. And we had to say, how are we going to rebuild? And number one on everyone's list was, we're not going to do this again. We don't want to have a world war ever again. That was the worst thing ever, right? So we're going to create a League of Nations, and we're just going to talk about things all the time, because if we talk about things, we won't go to war, right? And in fact, we're so positive about this that we create a law that says no war is allowed. Kellogg-Briand Pact, war is illegal, except for in self-defense. So good luck figuring out how that math works, chicken egg, if you can only have a war in self-defense, but it's actually going to be important later on. So that's how convinced we are with this League of Nations. And the League of Nations is tasked with creating world peace, because that's super easy. And one of the first things on their plate is what I just showed you in the map. I'll pull it up again in a minute, is this area of the mandates. We have this whole huge Ottoman Empire. It's a huge chunk of land. The Ottoman Empire doesn't exist anymore. We destroyed it. We won. It's our territory now. So the question is, what do we do with it? And the Western world, because let's be honest, the League of Nations was mostly the Western world. They look at this chunk of land and they say, you know what, we're going to be nationalist. We're going to help support these creations of local states that are represented by local governments that represent a type of people, okay? And we're going to create 3 mandates, okay? We're going to create the British Mandate of Palestine. We're going to create the British Mandate of Mesopotamia, aka Iraq, and we're going to create the French Mandate of Syria. Now, what is the goal of a mandate? Basically, the idea is that all these countries aren't ready to be countries yet. And I'll come back to that, but they're not ready to be countries. So what are we going to do? Us nice British, French people and the UN, we're going to help them become countries. We're going to lead them on the path to statehood, okay? But I want you to look at this map for a second and circle in on the British Mandate of Palestine. If we look at the British Mandate of Palestine right now, and we look at a current map, there's something should strike you almost immediately, hopefully, if you've looked at a map recently. Yeah, Liz.
That Lebanon and Turkey, are you talking about the separation of the, like, it's, so is that little green part, Lebanon, part of Turkey?
Yes, that it is, and it's not. Lebanon's very complicated, which we're not going to get the whole.
Not getting into. Okay.
No, but I was looking at the orange part itself. I guess it's kind of orange on orange, but just the little chunk. What was the British Mandate of Palestine? If we compare it to the map today, what did it consist of? The British Mandate of Palestine.
You got
Jordan
in there.
Jordan.
You got some
Good.
Syria in here, I think.
Jordan. So there's a little bit of Syria, but Jordan is the big thing. So basically, right away, the Hashemonites, the king of Jordan, they get this land already. It's about 2/3 of the British Mandate of Palestine. So this area of Palestine, if we're using that term, under the Ottoman Empire, covered this area. And this area already in 1921, basically right after the end of the war, right after the mandate is created, is sanctioned off as an Arab state, right? As Transjordan, okay? It won't get statehood independently until 1946, but already in 1921, it's basically earmarked as Jordan. It's going somewhere else. We're gonna ignore that part, okay? So we're going to focus on this little chunk. And as I said before, the Western world, the League of Nations, they don't think any of these groups are ready for a nation. Because what does it take to have a state? If we say we're going to have a state tomorrow, right? I actually played this game. I wanted to play with you guys, but I think it'd be a little too complicated on Zoom, where I go through the different Aliyah movements, starting already in the 1880s, and talk about, are we ready for a statehood? So if you had to make a list of things, I'm creating a state tomorrow. What do I need? I'm going to found the state of Lisatopia tomorrow. What do I need to have a state? Good. Vicky says an army. I need protection. That's an important one, especially if I need to defend myself. Land. Yeah. Land. What does it look like? How is it going to define ourselves? Money, currency. Those are all really important. How am I getting money? What does it look like? Leadership. That's a big question. What type of government do I have? How many, is it religion based? Is it a Congress? Is it a president? Is it a prime minister? What does that look like? Language is important. Again, it defines who we are as a nation. We need food, we need water. People, that'd be nice, right? How many people do we need to defend ourselves? Some other things that haven't been written yet: healthcare, education, right? These are infrastructure, trains, roads, right? These are all things that are going to be needed in order to create a state. So we, being the League of Nations, we need to help these people create a state. And I'll ruin the game for you, but the point is that I go through this whole thing where I spend basically like 50 years of the world history building up the state with my students, saying, are the Jews ready for a state? Are the Jews ready for a state? I'll tell you, in 1948, when Israel becomes a state, are we ready for a state? No, we're not. We don't have the population or maybe the army or the infrastructure or the food or the backing or the money or anything we want. But at some point, you got to throw students off a cliff and I guess you can create a state. But that was the goal of these mandates, right? Was to create this support. So we sit in this mandate period, and I want to emphasize something, because I've seen this a lot recently in the news, with pro-Palestinian movements. This period from 1919 to 1939 was not a peaceful period in this area. I've seen a lot of like, oh, the Jews and Arabs lived happily and they were all best friends, and it was only when the Jews made Israel that it was a problem. That's not true. The truth is that there were all sorts of pogroms, there was all sorts of fighting on both sides. Not always had particularly, like, again, I'm not saying there weren't friendships made in communities that were group communities, but on a whole, it was not a very peaceful thing, because unlike our Faisal-Weizmann agreement, everyone kind of saw everyone as the enemy. We all know that we're vying for a statehood here. We all know that there's a challenge here, and it's not the easiest thing, okay? And then, of course, already, and again, I know you might think that, 1919 to 1939 is a large chunk of time. It's not in the creation of statehood. By the time we all stand up for air, we're already heading into World War II. Before we talk about World War II, though, I want to talk about one more thing, because who is owning this mandate are the British. And the British love their laws and they love writing things down, right? So the British start this cycle called the White Paper cycle, where basically whenever there's a cycle of violence, the British send a committee to study it, because that's what we do. And then they write up a paper that says, this is what the problem was, and this is how we're going to fix it. And then the next time there was a violence, they do the same thing. It happens repeatedly throughout this period from 1919 to 1939. I'm not going to go through each and every one of them. I'm just going to focus on the very last one, and it's called the MacDonald White Paper. Basically, there had been a series of riots and pogroms. There had been fighting amongst Jews and Arabs in the Holy Land, and the British were getting a little sick of it, because again, they're like trying not to get into World War II over here, so they have a limited amount of resources. So the British make an announcement. They say, look, it's been 20 years now. We're all a little tired of each other. We got to get rid of this. So we say that in 10 years from 1939, we're going to establish a state. Okay, but I want to emphasize this. A Palestinian state, not a Jewish state. It could be a Jewish state, partially a Jewish state, but not totally a Jewish state. Okay. And they also say, what is the biggest problem, the biggest root of the problem right now? Why are the Arabs and the Jews fighting? What is the core of every problem here? It's that there's too many Jews immigrating to the land of Israel. That's the problem. So what do we do to fix that? We're going to stop immigration, or we're going to severely, severely limit immigration. Okay. Basically, from 1940 to 1945, we're only going to allow 75,000 Jews to enter this land, and that's it, because that's what's causing the problem. Too many Jews. Okay. Any idea how many Jews actually entered of those 75,000 over the next 5 years? Not many. And I want you to look carefully at the map over here, because this is the proposed plan in 1939 that the British proposed for the future. So they say, we'll create a Jewish state up in kind of the north of Israel and kind of along the coast. And then in the south, it'll be an Arab state. Yes, Emily.
Is that one of the reasons why more people couldn't escape to this area during World War II?
Absolutely. And actually, maybe even less importantly during World War II, but post World War II. So 1945, 1946, which I'll mention in a little bit, there's basically zero immigration, and that was one of the highest issues of we'll talk about some of the tensions. So yes, absolutely. They were not allowed to immigrate here, nor to the US. If you want to go down the black hole, there's something called the Evian Conference, which basically FDR in 1939 sees that there's a problem in the world and says, all the nations of the world get together, and we're going to say who's going to rescue the Jews from Europe, because we see how bad it's getting. All these nations get together, and FDR is the one who calls it together. Any idea how many nations agree to take the Jews?
I'm going to go with less than 5.
Yes, 3. Good guess. And they are, I know you might not like, the Dominican Republic is like, yeah, sure. So that's super helpful. They're not exactly the largest ones. Some of them, for instance, the Netherlands, great, except for they also get run over by Hitler, 5 minutes later. It's not great. There's some terrible things that come out of it. For instance, Australia has a fun quote where the representative from Australia says, "We don't have a racial problem, and we aren't desirous of importing one." implying that if we start importing Jews, allowing Jews into Australia, that's going to cause, the race problems. So this is very much an immigration limitation. We don't want Jews here. They're not allowed anywhere basically to travel, which is why Hitler gives up on that idea. So I want you to keep this map in mind. Okay. The other thing I'll point out on the map is you have this nice little shaded area where the British and the Western world are like, well, we really want to keep the port of Tel Aviv because that's really useful, and the holy city of Jerusalem, so that's also helpful. So we're going to keep this little chunk as an international line, and we're going to keep that. Okay. So now World War II is going on. And the Jews have the same kind of problem in World War II as they had in World War I. On the one hand, they're very upset at Britain right now. Britain just totally went back on their whole Balfour Declaration. They're now saying we don't really get a Jewish state. Maybe we do, a very little one. On the other hand, they don't want to fight for Hitler. It's also not an option. So David Ben-Gurion, who is kind of the leader of the Jewish people here, says, he has a famous quote: "We will fight the white paper as if there is no Hitler, and we'll fight Hitler as if there is no white paper." This idea that we will both fight the British for a state, but we will also fight against Hitler because we all see that's much worse than anything that's going on right now in this land. I know I'm going to skip all the war. We can do a whole other class on that and what happens in the war, but the war ends, and it has a huge impact because of two major reasons. One, the British Empire is tired. They have been fighting a war forever. They've lost a lot of people. They also have this kind of old colony mentality. So they have India, and they've got in Asia, and all these colonies are now fighting back. They all want their independence. Britain themselves are trying to focus on their own land, and then trying to hold themselves together and not fall apart. And they're just kind of done, right? They're like, we're ready for this to end. So that's one. The second is the world mindset, right? We've seen now, it's now 1946. We're starting to see the atrocities that's happened to the Jews. We're starting to hear stories. Maybe they do deserve their own land. Maybe we feel kind of guilty. When I was talking before about this immigration quota, for instance, there are famous stories of Jews. They get on boats to come to Palestine in 1946 because they are escaping pogroms. Jews are going back to their homes and getting killed in their homes because they're trying to take back homes that have been taken over. And they get all the way here, and either here in Palestine, they get put into deportation camps, which basically look like concentration camps. They have the same, you can come see one in Atlit, up here near Haifa. They get sent to Cyprus, where they get put in these big cages, or they get sent all the way back to Europe, where they get put back in concentration camps as displaced person camps. And none of that looks good, right? No one likes that look, especially when they meet, the French have met these ships with bulldogs and guns, and what does that look like when you're meeting Holocaust survivors like that? So these ideas are changing. So the British basically turned to the United Nations. The League of Nations fell apart. It lost. It didn't follow its law, so it didn't do too well. We're going to have a new version, the United Nations, new and better. And we are going to the British basically come to the United Nations and say, we're done. We've had enough. We can't deal with these mandates anymore. Do something with them. Help us figure out what to do. And the UN puts together what is called UNSCAP. I just like the short. They love their phrases. So the Special Committee on Palestine, right? How are we going to do Palestine? What are we going to do with it now that the war is over and the British want to leave? So in 1947, UNSCAP, this representative of the United Nations, they head to Palestine and they start traveling around. Now, the Jewish community in Palestine hears of this and they go all out. They are like, there's all these stories of them planting rows of flowers and then picking them up in trucks and traveling to the next spot and planting the same row of flowers in places. They dress up, they meet, they bow, they kiss feet, they, everything there is to do. They know they are on display. The Arab communities are less than impressed. Why do we have to prove to you this is our land? It's our land. We live here. Leave us alone. So whereas UNSCAP is going into the Jewish communities and there's flowers and banners and kids waving and candy getting thrown, they go into the Arab communities and there's just basically no one in the streets. No one wants to talk to them. No one's interested, or most people aren't interested. After they travel around Palestine, they actually go into Europe and see death camps. Not, you know, so you can imagine how that like affects their mentality of what their choice is. At the end, they come up with a proposal. So they say, here's our idea. Okay, we're going to create 2 states. Okay, so what you see here on this map, the yellowish orangey color is going to be the Arab state, and the bluish color is going to be the Jewish state. Okay, now I want to put something else in your mind first. In 1947, okay, the Jews are about 1/3 of the population. So Arabs make up about 2/3 of the population, and Jews make up 1/3 of the population. Okay, and if we look at the map, the Jews now get about 56% of the land. Okay,
But
so,
it's unresourced. It's
Ah.
desert.
But is it inhabitable?
good. So that whole bottom blue part is basically uninhabitable. Basically, there are small communities here. At the time, it was basically uninhabitable. But does that matter when you look at a map or numbers? Depends who you ask, right? The other thing is, again, there's just some challenges of logistics here. You might notice that this area that is now Gaza on your left has a nice little thin connector into the West Bank. What is now the West Bank has a nice little thin connector. How that would be protected, what that would look like, that's a big question. But this is what the map that is put together by the United Nations. Okay.
Lisa, is there any other country that looks like this with teeny tiny little connectors like that and basically discontiguous pieces?
I mean, you've got like Alaska, which we all just, you know, ignore here. Hawaii, no, I guess Hawaii's a little different because it's an island, but
At least that, right, but at least that island is contained. Like, that's the thing. This is like Swiss cheese.
right. Well, I was thinking about that about Alaska actually the other day, because I was wondering, you can drive actually from America to America through Canada into Alaska. I'm not sure many people do it because that's not the super inhabitable part of Alaska. So I don't think it's like very popular. I don't know if anyone would like, you know, go campaigning through there with an army, but maybe. Off the top of my head, that was just the first one I thought of. I don't know how many more there are like that. I'm sure there are a handful of others.
But how was this decided then? Because it's so bizarre.
So basically, they put dots on a map of where the largest populations were, right? And they said this area of the West Bank, for instance, the area of, you know, Jericho, Ramallah, Jenin, these are large Arab populations, therefore they should be controlled by Arabs. The Jews mostly live kind of up in that Haifa chunk along the coast, right below Haifa. So that's a big Jewish chunk. And then they have, although again, there's not many people hanging out in the desert that we can count, because a lot of Bedouins, but we don't really, they're hard to keep track of because they're nomadics, they move around a lot. So the settlements in the Negev are Jewish, even though they're kind of few and far between. So that's kind of how they pick a map. Although again, it's one of those things, I mean, we see this in the United States, we see it in Africa, when people draw lines on a map, they don't always like take into account actual geography, which you can, you know, see if you ever look at, you know, the middle of America or most of Africa, which just, you know, draws lines. So I'm not sure they ever thought further than the fact that, you know, hey, it makes the least amount of people pissed off, I think, possibly. I don't know if I'm supposed to say that line. Sorry, upset, whatever the term is. So this is the plan put forward, okay? Now, how did the Jews react?
Reluctant but willing.
Yeah. We
came to the table. We were willing to discuss.
Yeah, we can do something with it, right? And Ben Gurion, I mean, Ben Gurion was probably the most, I don't want to say the most cynical or the most realistic about it. Ben Gurion was basically like, look, we all know a war is going to break out 5 minutes after this is declared. So the lines on the map at this moment are irrelevant. It doesn't really matter, right? What we need to do is agree to it. And so we did. The Arab populations in this area were a lot less interested. They, again, from the Arab point of view, from the local point of view, why should we agree to this? This is our land. We live here, right? And if we look at the numbers, even though we took the Jewish population, the highest percentages, there's still 1/2 to 2/3 of the population in any given area that is still Arab. So they're still under this like Jewish umbrella, which they don't want to be in, and no one agreed to this. Truth be told, it doesn't matter, because the UN is in control of this land and the British are in control of this land, and therefore it goes to the UN vote. And the UN passed this. It's actually a fascinating thing. We can go into a whole story about this also. It's Thanksgiving. And of course, the UN is situated in New York. So they basically filibuster throughout the Thanksgiving weekend in order to get more votes to create this, to pass the partition plan. And the partition plan is passed. Then two things happen. Immediately after it's passed in November of 1947, a war breaks out. And I say that in quotes because it's not a war. And why is it not a war? Because the British are still in the land of Israel, right? And no foreign country is going to attack England, even if they're tired post-World War II, right? Jordan's not going to do it. Syria's not going to do it. Egypt's not going to do it. No one wants to do that. So what they do is there are basically incursions between the local Arabs and the local Jewish populations fighting over this land, okay? That leads all the way up to 1948. In May of 1948, the British finally leave, right? They step out. And on that same day, or actually really the day before, the Ben Gurion declares a state, okay? And once he declares a state, then an actual war breaks out, okay? In the sense that then we have foreign nations that get involved. So we go from this map. Oh, sorry, this is the map of the UN of the voting. If you want to look at the numbers of voting, 72% of people, all those green, they all voted to pass it. The dark red don't like us. The light red weren't there, and the yellowish were absent too, like didn't abstained. So just so you can kind of see a map of the world and how the voting looked. So now it's 1948. And Israel gets attacked again, depending on how you count countries, because Iraq sends in a handful of troops. Jordan only sends a handful of troops, but only into the West Bank. And they are attacked from all sides by 5 armies, depending on how we're counting numbers and countries. And it is a war. This is where the war actually happens. Now, again, we could have a whole course, and I've only got 10 minutes now, of what the war looks like and how the Jews win the war. But it starts in May. It really only ends in 1949. Okay? And are you trying to tell me something, or am I just... So it really only ends in 1949. We go through the course of the war, and it is devastating, right? Most of the Jewish population is young, is new. We have a lot of Holocaust survivors who are just fresh off the boat, who just basically jump off the boat to go to war. But we gain land. Okay. And in fact, in 1949, when we start making these armistices, there is a push against Ben Gurion to actually attack into the West Bank, to take over all the West Bank and go all the way into what is now Jordan. And Ben Gurion says it's not worth it. Let's stop. So starting in February of 1949, all the way through the summer of 1949, we begin to make armistices. Is armistice, is that the plural of armistice? Is armistices?
Armistice.
Armistice. So whatever it is, we begin to make these agreements now, but it is an important word. Why do I use the word armistice and not a peace treaty or a peace agreement? What's the difference?
State on state.
Okay. And what is it? What is an armistice not?
It's not complete peace. It's like a break.
Good. It's a little more than a ceasefire and a little less than a treaty, right?
Somewhere in between.
So, and it's very clear. For instance, when we make a treaty with Jordan and Egypt, there's a very clear line, and I'll read it to you, that says in it, the armistice demarcation line, aka the green line, is not to be construed in any sense as a political or territorial boundary. So like, here's our line of stopping, but it's not a territory, right? And it continues, it does not change the rights, claims, or positions of either party to the armistice as regards the ultimate settlement of the Palestine question. So again, we're just kind of pausing fighting, but
it was signed with the Arab Legion or the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, not Palestinian representatives, correct?
Right. With Jordan, with Egypt, with Syria, and with Lebanon.
They just weren't present. The Palestinian leadership wasn't available, or they just weren't existent.
So,
like
they didn't have a strong enough one, in the sense that they weren't united. There was in Gaza, for instance, a Palestinian government that was basically run over by the Egyptians and was seen as a proxy, not a proxy, what's the word? Like a
puppet.
puppet, thank you, of the Egyptian government. So there wasn't really, again, a unified group to come to the table, right? And they had been attacked by these countries. So the armistices were signed by the countries, right? And not by the Palestinians or the locals, the Arabs. Terminology gets twisted at this point a little bit because we have to be very careful about who we're referring to. So if we look at the map here now, the red outline is now where the map of Israel is in 1949. Okay, so you can see we've gained land. We gained that chunk, actually like where I live right now in Kiryat Gat. We've gained that chunk of land kind of in the middle. We haven't got Gaza. We haven't got what's now called the West Bank, this area. The West Bank will be taken over by Jordan. Jordan will incorporate the West Bank. In fact, they like triple their population overnight when they take over the West Bank. They inherit millions of people in the West Bank, and they give them citizenship and they give them rights. I don't want to say it's hunky-dory, but it's pretty equal. The situation in Gaza is very, very different. Again, they have this kind of puppet government until 1956. Then there's some terror attacks. Israel kind of gets involved because there's terror attacks coming from the Egyptian area. Then Egypt takes over basically completely and says, you don't get citizenship. They actually have these like all Palestine passports. They're not citizens of basically any country in Gaza. And they have a very different situation from those in the West Bank. Okay. And this is kind of how we sit. Now, I want to just mention one more thing, and I know I'm at the end of my time, and we always get too excited, but this is important because what happens is a displacement. Absolutely, there's a displacement, right? And we see this happening today also, that in war, things happen. I don't want to say that, but people get displaced, whether they flee, and people do flee, whether they get kicked out, and people do get kicked out, whether they choose to leave, and they choose to leave in all those different ways. They end up in places that aren't their home, and they become refugees. And in 1945, at the end of World War II, the UN created the UNHRC, which was basically a body that was supposed to protect the refugees. So what makes you a refugee? It means that you don't have protection in your home country, right? Let's say I am in, I don't know, in America, and I feel that the American government's trying to kill me because of my race or my religion or whatever it is. I can appeal as status as a refugee to find other housing, right? To find a safe place to live, okay? And what makes me not a refugee anymore? Let's say I'm a Syrian refugee, I'm fleeing Syria. When I land somewhere, let's say the United States, and I gain citizenship, now I'm safe. I'm no longer a refugee, okay? But after 1949, the UN creates a second agency called the UNRWA, UNRWA. And this agency is solely for Palestinian refugees. Now, what makes you a Palestinian refugee? It means that you were born between, basically you lived in this area between 1946 and 1948, and you were displaced as a part of this war, or you are the descendant of a male refugee of Palestine, okay? Which means that this is like a never-ending number. There is no way to lose your Palestinian refugee status, right? If I am a Palestinian refugee and I move to America and gain American citizenship, I can still count in the numbers of a Palestinian refugee, okay? Which means like these are always the comments we make. I always forget her names. Haddad, Gigi, the actresses. Their father is a Palestinian refugee, therefore they officially count as Palestinian refugees. Right? They themselves cannot pass it on, but they are the descendants of males, okay, of a male Palestinian refugee. And that means that we are now caught in an odd area that's going to be important in the next couple of classes. And I know it's 9 o'clock, it's 2 o'clock, whatever time it is in the East Coast. So if you have to run, I understand, I'll just wrap it up now and you can save it for the next classes. I encourage you guys to come tomorrow and on Sunday. The history of all this point, which we got this whole hour with, is that it's a complicated history, basically. Nothing exists in a bubble. There are a lot of international sources. And that in the end, the current, in 1949, boundaries of Israel were the direct result of this war of independence, which again, we can tie back to all the instances we talked about before. Class tomorrow is same time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. Class on Sunday is at noon, just to be different. But that will continue our conversation. They are also amazing teachers.